Speaker.
The gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Levin, is recognized for 9 minutes.
Let me be clear what's at stake here on the Colombia FTA. I feel so deeply about it. Free trade agreements set the terms of competition between nations. It's more than about the mathematical flow of goods. The conditions for workers in the country we trade with are fundamental to that competition. Workers in Colombia have long been without their basic worker rights. More than any other democracy in the globe, there have been extreme levels of violence against workers and their leaders. There's been a universal, really a universal lack of justice for murders of union activists. And there have been extensive flaws in Colombia's labor law and its practices. These conditions and the insistence of Democrats that they be effectively and fully enforced are what held up consideration of the Colombia Free Trade Agreement. What has been long overdue was work on these conditions, and there wasn't by the Bush or the Uribe administrations. Yes, it's taken 5 years, because most of those years were taken up by inaction by our administration, the Bush administration, and by the administration previous to Mr. Santos. So earlier this year, an action plan on labor rights was negotiated between the new American and Colombian administrations, and it included some commitments and deadlines at long last for Colombia to address issues of worker rights, violence, and impunity. Very regretfully, some key obligations have not been met in a meaningful way. Let me give you one example about a condition that I saw firsthand in visits to Colombia. Their employers have a history of using sham cooperatives and other contract relationships to camouflage true employment relationships and thereby to rob workers of their rights. The ILO has long identified this type of practice as among the most serious problems facing Colombian workers. In Colombia, only workers who are directly employed can form a union and collectively bargain. Colombia committed to stop such abuses in the action plan, and it passed some far-reaching legislation and proposed effective regulations. But unfortunately, it then has backed away. Through loopholes in the law, it has allowed employers in Colombia, including a major beverage company and palm oil producers, to begin converting cooperatives to other contract forms to continue denying workers their basic rights. So privately, we Democrats in the House pushed the Colombians for months to try to stem this problematic shift. But even a clarification it issued on the eve of the markup last week, after public pressure had been brought to bear, fell short. So this problem highlights precisely why it was vital to link the action plan to the FTA we're voting on today. But very regrettably, the Republicans blocked any reference at all to the labor action plan in the implementation bill, and unfortunately, the administration acquiesced in that position. And I just want to emphasize, explicitly linking the action plan to entry into force of the Colombia FTA was necessary as a vital step to ensure effective, meaningful implementation of the action plan. Without such a linkage, we have no leverage to ensure that Colombia lives up to the commitments it's made. And I also want to emphasize, it provides no context and meaning for the enforcement of the FTA worker rights standards in the future. The language in the FTA is the basic international worker rights language. It is general in its provision. It has to be given meaning, and the action plan would help to give it meaning if in the future action needed to be taken under the dispute settlement system. And so when there's no linkage between the implementation and the action plan, it takes away the context for future action. Other obligations under the action plan have not been meaningfully met. Despite minimal requirements set in the action plan, Colombian employers continue to use direct negotiations with workers, referred to as collective pacts, to thwart workers from organizing, and I saw firsthand the use of those collective pacts when I was in Colombia on one of my 3 visits. And another problem, a pervasive problem, was highlighted earlier this month by Human Rights Watch. Little progress in investigating and prosecuting murders of people trying to exercise their rights, even those cases designated as priorities. Colombia authorities obtained just 6 convictions of 195 union murders that occurred in the 4+ years leading up to May 2011. And it's told that the ILO left off Colombia on its list. That's because employers vetoed Colombia being on the list. And notwithstanding clear commitments under the action plan to improve the situation through reforms in investigatory policies and methods, Colombia did not take the first step to do this, namely the publication of an analysis of closed union murder cases, until the eve of the markup, even though the action plan called for its completion. Even with this, it is clear that additional leverage is necessary. Interviews by Human Rights Watch with Colombian prosecutors reveal that there's been no clear direction to implement new policies and methods as committed to under the action plan. I wish I could stand here today and say that Colombia had fully implemented the commitments under the action plan to date, and very significantly, vitally, that the legislation incorporated the action plan and conditioned the FTA's entry into force on its effective implementation. I cannot in good conscience do so. Therefore, I urge my colleagues to oppose the Colombia Free Trade Agreement. And I yield back the balance.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time.